Recap in minutes. In today's video, we will be enjoying a war action film, entitled Das Boot. There will be spoilers ahead, chill out and enjoy. The movie begins on a dark road near the French coast near La Rochelle. Three U-96 officers travel. Many sailors in uniform can be seen staggering about the streets while under the influence of alcohol. They act quite rudely toward the officers, even urinating on the passing automobile. The officers seem unfazed by this. Eventually, the officers make it to the rowdy bar. The crew of the U-96 is being honored and sent off with a feast in honor of their captain, Thompson, who has recently been decorated. Several drunken incidents occur. The officers are little more than a group of mischievous teenagers. The captain of U-96 watches in composure. Later, Lieutenant Werner, a party reporter who will be traveling with them on their next tour to write about how awesome the Reich's sub-crews are, is introduced to the captain. They meet the chief, the ship's senior chief engineer and the captain's de facto second in command. There's been some bad news concerning his wife back home, so he's headed out to check on her. With the help of two officers, a visibly intoxicated Thompson is let out. They regret the fact that today's crews are made up entirely of teenagers and that the seasoned veterans are quickly disappearing. Thompson, standing before the crowd, delivers a speech that borders on anti-Nazi language but concludes on a high note, obscenely applauding the Führer for his valiant stance against Winston Churchill and Britain. Thompson is discovered in the men's room with a large amount of vomit on the floor and a much higher blood alcohol content than previously. In the shipyards of La Rochelle, France, U-96 is staffed by the captain, Lieutenant Werner, and the chief. The captain addresses the ship's company and formally presents Werner to the crew. The first lieutenant stands out as a spoiled young hardline Nazi, whereas the second lieutenant is a slick prankster who is always getting the better of the first. The reporter, Lieutenant Werner, is shown the junior officers' bunks, where he learns that everyone, including the officers, must bunk together due to a lack of available beds. Lieutenant Werner gets teased by fellow prankster Pilgrim and becomes close with Ullman, a young officer back home who is smitten with a French woman and writes her letters frequently. Johann, the engine room chief and a lanky white guy whom the crew calls the Ghost, makes his first appearance here as well. The crew has to go through the boredom of routine training. At first, Lieutenant Werner is obsessed with his camera, photographing everything in sight. The crew goes about their daily tasks with growing dreariness. Everyone but the first lieutenant stops shaving and grows beards, and their monotony is broken only by a false alarm set by the captain to keep them on their toes. The captain's disdain for the Nazis becomes clear, and the high command seems to be in a terrible mood. At one point, the captain makes the decision to test the submarine's depth capability. The gauge indicates a 170-meter safe zone, but the captain reduces it to over 200 meters, much to the dismay of the crew. When the captain finally gives the order to bring the sub back up, everyone is relieved to hear the ominous creaking noises stop coming from the hull. The submarine finally receives word that a convoy has been discovered, ending the subsequent monotony. The crew is ecstatic about the prospect of going after them, but the captain dissuades them by saying they won't make it there in time. The submarine then accelerates at full speed ahead in an attempt to catch up to a passing convoy, an order that the captain gives almost shortly afterward. They make their way through the thick fog toward the convoy, but one of the destroyers in the escort fleet discovers them, forcing the sub to dive. After sustaining multiple depth charges from the destroyer without incurring any serious damage, the captain finally manages to lose them and make his getaway. The captain has noticed that the British destroyers are becoming increasingly sophisticated and error-free. The crew is in fairly high spirits despite being completely depressed by the fact that they came nothing near sinking a ship and barely escaped with their lives. Lieutenant Werner occupies a seat central to the crew's attention. Crabs infest half the crew. After a brief period of joy at running into one of the other 11 submarines in the Atlantic, the captain becomes frustrated by the poor navigation and planning that led to 1/6 of the fleet being in the same place at the same time for no good reason. A new communication reports that a massive convoy has been sighted and that several other submarines are en route to it. They choose to join in as well, sneaking up on the convoy and sinking two of the cargo ships with torpedoes. They see a destroyer off in the distance while they are firing the torpedoes, but they don't expect it to be a problem. After firing all of the torpedoes, however, the captain lost sight of the destroyer through the periscope. When he does notice it, it's barreling down on them at full speed. After a quick dive, they are able to avoid harm from the depth charges. As the torpedoes explode, they celebrate, but their joy is short-lived as they hear the first horrible ping of the destroyer's ASDIC system. The sub can only sit and listen to the ever-increasing pings and cross its fingers that the oncoming warship doesn't notice them. Nonetheless, It detects them and launches a full-scale depth charge attack. A photo shows Johann crammed under some machinery, hands covering his face, and he looks terrified and miserable. The captain successfully avoids the destroyer, but then another one attacks them from the opposite direction. The captain has given them no other alternative except to dive extremely deep, well into the danger zone indicated by the depth gauge's red color. As a result of the water pressure, bolts begin to pop inward, damaging machinery and injuring crew members. Johann, now completely insane, staggers onto the bridge while babbling gibberish. Johann lurches in the direction of the captain after he instructs him to return to his post. When the captain leaves, the other officers are able to free Johann. As he calms down, the captain puts down the revolver he had grabbed in a panic to cope with Johann's outburst. All traces of the destroyers eventually vanish, but the sub stays under for another 6 hours just to be sure. It then comes to the surface to discover that one of the ships it torpedoed was an oil tanker, which it ringed with a blaze of flaming oil but which managed to avoid sinking. For good measure, the captain gives the order to fire another torpedo at it. The submarine crew watches as the torpedo hits the tanker and realizes that some people managed to get out of it. The captain is furious since no one arrives to save them after waiting for 6 hours. A group of survivors swims up to the submarine, but the captain sadly instructs them to turn away. Lieutenant Werner, in particular, and the rest of the crew who see this, are shaken up by what they've seen. The ship is low on food and gasoline, so the crew is hoping to make it to La Rochelle, France, soon. Instead, they are given the ominous directive to meet up with a covert German supply ship in the neutral Spanish port of Vigo. After receiving and deciphering another top-secret message, revealing that U-96 will not be returning to La Rochelle but instead will be crossing the Mediterranean from the British-controlled Straits of Gibraltar to the Italian coastal town of La Spezia, since the Strait of Gibraltar is one of the most highly protected Allied naval zones in the world, the captain arranges for Lieutenant Werner and the chief, whose wife is critically ill, to leave the submarine in the Spanish port and make their way back to Germany. Lieutenant Werner is reluctant to leave, but Captain maintains that he has been in peril long enough. The subordinate officer asks Werner to deliver his love letters to his French sweetheart, and Werner agrees to do so. Johann approaches the captain about abandoning his station and offers his regrets, as well as his assurance that this will be the last time it happens and a request that he is not court-martialed. Even though he is hesitant at first, the captain accepts Johann's repentance and releases him. They make it to Vigo, and the Weser, the name of the secret supply ship, is incredibly luxurious. After boarding, the officers are greeted like heroes by the ship's devoted crew. Officers are unhappy and resent being treated like princes. And it doesn't help that the crew keeps badgering them to share their thrilling stories. When recounting their most recent run and the near destruction they nearly experienced during the tremendous depth charging they received, the captain's visage and voice became haunted. The captain's brief respite is interrupted by a dispatch from the command center. They won't let Lieutenant Werner and the chief go on leave. Their only option is to remain on board till the very end. The chief is obviously distressed, but he rationalizes that it's for the best because his potential successor is a clueless teenager. Lieutenant Werner has mixed feelings about returning the subordinate officer's love letters, but he is angry about it anyway. Once the ship is restocked, they continue on their journey. The submarine makes a brief pit stop away from the Strait of Gibraltar to assess the situation. British warships are visible in the distance, guarding the narrow strait between the rocks. To avoid being spotted by the opposing fleet, the captain has decided to make a stealthy approach to the gap, dive deep at the last minute, and hope for a favorable tide. Aside from the captain, nobody seems to have much faith in this strategy. At just the right moment, they break into a sprint toward the straits. Unfortunately, thanks to the development of Allied naval radar equipment, they are immediately identified, and a British fighter plane promptly begins strafing the sub and dropping a bomb on it. The ships start firing and blowing up around them. As soon as the captain and navigator re-enter the submarine, it begins submerging. Sadly, the bomb damage has rendered the submarine unable to recover from the dive. It continues to delve further and deeper, well past the depth at which the bolts once again begin to blow out, and the hull begins making horrific noises. Several pipes rupture under pressure, and water begins to fill various compartments of the submarine. The submarine eventually stops on a rock at a depth of roughly 280 meters, well past the depth gauge's maximum reading. The ship's engines have stopped operating, and water is quickly rising inside. At the same time, the doctor is doing everything he can to save the navigator's life while he bleeds to death. The team works quickly to repair the damage and prevent the entire submarine from flooding. Heroically, Johann plunges into a deep flood puddle to locate and plug the source of a large leak while everyone else frantically crams whatever they can into the openings. The chief risked inhaling the toxic vapors from the leaking battery acid as he wriggled under the floor panels to replace many broken batteries. The captain and the chief look over their predicament as the leaks are sealed, and the shot navigator recovers. It will take a lot of work to repair the damage and drain the water, but if everything goes right, they may have a single chance to get to the surface. Because of the limited supply of oxygen, they must move swiftly. To deal with the overwhelming quantity of water, the crew sets about emptying it into the deck via bucket brigade. In the meantime, the chief keeps working on the damage. Hours later, all of the water has been bailed, and the team is completely spent from the ordeal. Reduced oxygen levels are quite dangerous. While the chief works on the repairs, the captain tells the rest of the crew to kick back in their bunks and take it easy. The men wear little oxygen masks while they sleep in their bunks. Everyone on board has given up hope of survival and is now lying lifeless on the floor of the submarine. The captain is so hopeless that he even points the finger of guilt at himself for the crew's plight. However, the chief successfully completes the repairs and is optimistic about their chances. The chief and captain have decided to give it a shot. They release their ballast and begin to slowly ascend. Surprisingly, when Johann ignites the engines, they start up and function. Everybody is relieved to finally reach the surface and breathe some fresh air. The captain from the lookout tower exclaims with relief that they can escape, as the British have assumed that they are all dead. The submarine makes a clumsy return to La Rochelle. The crowds of people who come out to see the weary sailors are treated to a hero's welcome. They appear to be worn out yet relieved to have arrived safely. The sound of an air raid siren blares in the distance. U-96 is not the only target of the enemy's bombers and machine guns. Some of the submarine's crew, including Lieutenant Werner and the chief, make it to safety in a shelter. Lieutenant Werner investigates the damage after the planes have taken off. The movie ends with the rest of the crew dead. On the dock were the bodies of Johann, the second lieutenant, Ullman, and others. Werner arrives at the captain, who is still standing despite bleeding slightly from the mouth and slowly collapsing. Werner watches in dismay. The captain survives long enough to watch U-96 disappear beneath the waves. Werner is shown holding the lifeless captain. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this and help the channel grow.